strongly aligned on environment, on fighting COVID and getting through this pandemic, preparing for future challenges, but also on building back better and recovering our economies in ways that work for the middle class, for people working hard to join it in a way that is inclusive and fair. And we've got a lot of work to continue to do. The easy work is done here at home. The hard work around the world, making sure we're bringing people along.
The Three Amigos summit is taking place in Washington, D.C. U.S. President Joe Biden isn't making any promises on whether he will scrap his tax credit proposal for new electric vehicles. The incentive would provide up to $12,500 to a new car owner who buys an electric vehicle, as long as that vehicle is produced in the United States.
And the Canadian government argues the offer could impact Canada's auto sector and even violate the new NAFTA. Well, when Biden met with Prime Minister Trudeau today, the U.S. president said the issue was one the two leaders would be discussing. Well, let's bring in Aurel Braun, professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto and associate of the Davis Center at Harvard University. And we also have Stephen Farnsworth, the political science professor with the University of Mary Washington. Stephen, I'll start with you because this is the first time that the three leaders of these countries have met since 2016. And I'm curious if you think this is a little bit more symbolic over substance.
Well, it's really important to restart this regular trilateral summit. During the Trump years, of course, there was no such summit. And I think that one of the things that you see with President Biden is a much greater appreciation for the extent to which the United States is better off working with its allies, working with other nations in North America, rather than insulting leaders and the people of some other countries. It's a welcome change from the point of view of the recognition that countries have to work together to make progress.
Well, speaking of working together, you know, over from the predecessor of the current U.S. president, there was this a lot of talks about protectionism, Buy American, and now this looking at this new bill, Build Back Better, $1.7 trillion bill. Aurel, I'm curious, you know, what is different about the narrative that's happening right now? Is this just, I guess, a softer tone from the current president? What's different between the two?
The narrative certainly is better. The atmospherics are more positive. And leaders and personalities are important. But relations among states are vastly more than just the relationship between the leaders. It involves all of the other issues. And what we are seeing here is that despite the positive atmospherics, we are witnessing a kind of application of the law of unintended consequences. That is, there's been a movement, a very major and necessary movement towards trying to deal with grave and urgent environmental issues. But the kind of contradictions that exist between that and short-term economic goals have remained unresolved. So consequently, you see that those good intentions are also resulting in a kind of blowback, that as you transition from hydrocarbons in a major way to renewable energy, there's bound to be a kind of pain of transition. This is what we saw when systems changed, whether it was in Eastern Europe or in Spain or Portugal. And we are now having to cope with that. It's not going to go away no matter how nice the words are. We saw evidence already where President Biden shut down the Keystone Pipeline. There are issues now regarding the pipeline in the case of Enbridge that could have devastating effects on Canada. And then, of course, moving towards electrical vehicles has a huge potential impact as well. The subsidies are not accidental.
And Stephen, let's pick up on that, this incentive that the U.S. government is looking to offer to people interested in buying electric vehicles. Why is this something the Biden administration is looking at? And how many jobs are we looking at that could be at stake here?
Well, what's very clear about Biden's situation is that it's a difficult one from the domestic political environment in the United States. He is underwater in terms of negative overall approval rating. Most people are really frustrated with COVID and the economic concerns about inflation and supply chain issues. You add to that he has a narrow majority in Congress, just a few seats in the House, and just a Senate tiebreaker vice president, and you create an environment where Joe Biden is not really as free to make choices as he might want. And so I think you see a very, very aggressive effort to try to convince American workers and American consumers that there are efforts underway to make sure that those jobs, potentially numbering in the thousands, are going to be promoted in terms of the United States. It's the reality is that America tends to have a public opinion that's largely protectionist. It doesn't really appreciate the benefits of free trade, but only fears the loss of jobs. And so, in that kind of political environment, Joe Biden can perhaps talk a good game, but certainly in terms of policy, he has to be very wary of opening himself and the Democratic Party to Republican attacks that he's giving away the store.
And Aurel, you talked about those unintended consequences, especially when we're talking about moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And the reality is this country has failed miserably to export one of our greatest resources, which is energy. But on the flip side, looking at today, and we're looking at all the things that could potentially come out for Canadians, and the failure to end the softwood lumber tariffs. I mean, once again, this is, not the kind of thing that Canadians want to hear, and this could greatly impact many Canadians, especially when it comes to softwood lumber.
There are multiple issues, and we do respect, even if President Biden would have a much greater majority than he already has in the House, and if he had a vast majority in the Senate, it would not be all that different, because once he made the decision that he wants to move very quickly to transition out from energy that is based on fossil fuels to renewable energy, when he proposes to have this Build Back America, which is inherently protectionist, you can see this not just in the case of Canada, you can see the concerns that are expressed by Lopez Obrador in Mexico, known as AMLO, that he's very concerned about this kind of protectionism. In fact, the fact that Mr. Biden does not have that large a majority perhaps will slow down that program, and that, ironically, may benefit Canada.
And Stephen, do you think these are the kind of things that could trigger a trade war?
So, I mean, what's important to recognize that even when there are disagreements, there are still mechanisms for resolving them. We have, through the NAFTA situation and through the WTO, a series of provisions that allow for the adjudication, the evaluation of the claims of different parties when they feel aggrieved. And so if there isn't some way to work out an arrangement acceptable to the three nations involved here, why, there are other provisions that will create an environment that will allow this to be resolved without too much of a combative environment. It's important to remember that the global economy is in such a precarious position right now in terms of COVID and supply chain issues, the risk of inflation, particularly in the United States. You add all those things up, and the last thing that any of these leaders want is any kind of trade war. That would simply be devastating and unproductive for all three of the countries involved.
Stephen Farnsworth, Aurel Braun, we really appreciate your time joining us on CP24 tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.